In a frozen village in Canada, investigators found cooking fires still burning. But the people weren't missing yet. Something far worse had already happened. And what was found buried in the snow is the reason this mystery still has no clear explanation. Before I tell you what was discovered, you need to understand how impossible this disappearance really was. This is the mystery of Angikuni Lake. Deep in the Arctic wilderness of northern Canada, near a remote body of water known as Angikuni Lake, there once stood a small Inuit settlement. It was isolated. There were no highways, no permanent roads, no radio stations, no emergency services. In winter, even experienced travelers could disappear forever, just a few kilometers away from safety. Only frozen lakes, endless tundra, and vast open land. For much of the year, the sun barely rises above the horizon, and for weeks at a time, storms can completely erase the landscape. Roughly 30 to 50 people are believed to have lived in this small community. Families, children, elders, hunters, people who had learned, over generations, how to survive in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. Life in the Arctic is built on preparation. Food is hunted, cleaned, dried, and stored carefully. Every tool is repaired. Every dog is fed and protected. Every shelter is checked constantly. If one part of that system fails, the entire community can suffer. There is no room for panic. There is no room for mistakes. And there is almost no room for sudden decisions, which makes what happened next so difficult to explain. In November of 1930, a fur trapper named Joe LaBelle was traveling through the region. He was not a tourist. He was not an explorer searching for adventure. He was a working trapper who had spent years moving through remote northern territory. He understood the weather, he understood the land, and he understood what abandoned camps usually look like. When people leave in a hurry, there are signs. When people leave because they are relocating, there are signs. And when something goes wrong, there are always signs. As he approached the small settlement near Angikuni Lake, he expected to see smoke rising from homes. He expected to hear dogs. He expected to be greeted. Instead, he found silence. At first, everything looked normal. The huts were standing. The structures were intact. Nothing appeared burned or damaged. Supplies were visible. Equipment had not been destroyed. But something felt wrong. And within minutes, he realized this wasn't simply a village between hunting trips. He was standing in a place where life had stopped suddenly. The homes were empty. Inside, food had been left out. Some meals appeared half-finished. Cooking pots still rested near small fires. Utensils and containers were left where people had last placed them. Clothing hung inside the shelters. Tools were stacked neatly. Nothing had been packed. Nothing had been gathered. It was as if the villagers had simply stood up and walked away. But this is where the story becomes deeply disturbing. What he noticed next made him leave the village in fear. Near the edge of the settlement was a small cemetery. It was modest. Simple wooden markers, shallow, frozen ground. Several graves appeared to have been disturbed. According to later reports, some of them were found open. And even more unsettling, some were said to be empty. No remains. No clear explanation. But the most chilling discovery wasn't in the cemetery. Not far from the huts, the villagers' sled dogs were found dead, still tied to their posts, still attached to the wooden stakes. They had not been attacked. They had not been shot. They had not been mauled by wild animals. They had starved, slowly, in the same place they were always kept. In Arctic communities, sled dogs are not just animals. They are transportation. They are survival tools. They are essential for hunting, hauling, and long-distance travel. Without dogs, people become almost completely trapped. These animals were the community's lifeline, which means whoever left this village knew they were never coming back. And what investigators failed to find is even harder to explain. There were no footprints, no sled tracks, no clear paths leading away from the settlement. And this next detail is the one most people miss. In fresh Arctic snow, even one person leaves visible marks. A group of people would leave unmistakable trails, But around the entire village, the ground appeared undisturbed, as though nobody had walked away at all. Leaving without food, equipment, or animals would almost certainly mean death. In these temperatures, exposure alone can become fatal in hours. Yet no bodies were ever discovered, not near the settlement, not along nearby lakes, not along known travel routes, not in the surrounding wilderness, nowhere. If you enjoy real unsolved mysteries like this, you will probably want to hear the final theory at the end, because it completely changes how this story feels. After leaving the area, Joe LaBelle eventually reported what he had seen to Canadian authorities. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police were notified. At the time, communication in the north was slow. Messages had to travel through long chains of officials and outposts. Organizing a response could take days or weeks. Eventually, a search operation was arranged. Officers traveled by sled and on foot. They moved slowly through dangerous terrain. Whiteout conditions could appear without warning. Frozen lakes could hide thin ice. Wind could erase tracks in minutes. Searchers questioned other trappers and travelers. They asked nearby communities if they had seen families moving through the area. They examined nearby hunting routes. They searched for signs of camps, but no trace of the villagers could be found. No abandoned tents, no cooking sites, no equipment, no remains, no signs of relocation. According to the reports that later circulated, the investigation produced no answers, and for a time, the mystery remained largely unknown outside the region. But years later, researchers began to question whether this investigation even happened in the way it was originally reported. And this is where the story splits into two very different versions. Some researchers believe there were practical explanations. The villagers may have followed migrating animals. In the Arctic, entire communities sometimes move when herds change their routes. They may have relocated because of food shortages. A single poor hunting season can threaten survival. Or they may have been forced to move by extreme weather. Blizzards can isolate villages for weeks. Ice can break travel routes. Temporary relocation was not unusual. But every logical explanation breaks down at the same point. Why would they leave food behind? Why leave tools that would be essential to survival? Why abandon winter clothing? Why leave cooking fires still burning? Why leave so suddenly that no organized packing took place? And most importantly, why abandon the dogs? No seasonal migration explains that. No planned relocation explains that. No weather emergency explains the lack of tracks. And no organized move explains the silence that followed, which is why many people believe something else happened. Stories began to circulate about strange lights in the sky. Some claimed a mysterious aircraft was seen above the region shortly before the disappearance. Others described glowing objects moving silently over the frozen land. Some suggested military testing. Others suggested visitors from far beyond Earth. And still others believed the villagers were overtaken by sudden, uncontrollable fear. A wave of panic so powerful that an entire community fled at once. But there is one detail that makes these stories harder to dismiss. In Inuit oral traditions from the region, there are stories of powerful spirits, entities said to imitate familiar sounds, entities said to call hunters by name, entities said to lure people away from safety and into storms, stories of entire hunting parties disappearing into blizzards, never to return. For some, the Angikuni story became connected to these much older legends, not as proof, but as a warning. Still, not everyone accepts the mystery as it is commonly told. And now comes the uncomfortable possibility. What if the mystery itself was distorted? Decades later, historians and journalists began examining newspaper articles from the 1930s. What they discovered raised serious questions. The story changed over time. Some articles mentioned empty graves. Others never mentioned graves at all. Some described dozens of missing people. Others were vague about how many actually lived at the site. Some reports described a massive police operation. Others barely mentioned any official investigation. Even the details about Joe LaBelle changed. Some articles portrayed him as deeply shaken. Others simply described him as surprised. Some accounts added dramatic dialogue. Others contained only short statements. The further the story traveled from its original sources, the more dramatic it became. In many cases, later writers repeated details from earlier newspaper stories without confirming the information. Each retelling added new elements. Each retelling increased the mystery. Each retelling made the event feel larger and more terrifying. But documentation from the time is limited. Much of what people believe today comes from retellings written many years after the supposed disappearance, which leads to a difficult question. Was there truly a mass disappearance? Or did a much smaller, more ordinary event slowly transform into one of the world's most famous mystery stories? Some historians suggest the settlement may have been seasonal, that the residents had already planned to move, that Joe LaBelle may have arrived after the village had been quietly vacated, and that later writers may have misunderstood what they were seeing. Others propose that only a small group may have lived there, that the numbers were exaggerated, that the idea of dozens of people vanishing may have grown with each retelling. But even this explanation has its own problems, because no confirmed records ever identified where the villagers went. No families were later located. No official relocation sites were clearly connected to the group. No clear destination was ever documented. If the community did relocate, their trail disappears completely from historical records. If a tragedy occurred far away from the village, it left no confirmed physical evidence. And if the original story was exaggerated, it still became one of the most persistent disappearance legends in history. But even if parts of the story were distorted, one question still has no answer. What actually happened to the people who once lived beside Angikuni Lake? Did a community quietly move and fade into history? Did a disaster take place far from any witnesses? Did a combination of misunderstanding, poor records, and dramatic journalism create a mystery that never truly existed in the way we imagine it? Or did something happen that was never properly documented at all? In the Arctic, history can vanish as quickly as footprints in fresh snow. Storms erase evidence, ice reshapes the land, and communities can disappear from written records even when their descendants still exist elsewhere. A village disappeared. No confirmed graves. No survivors who could be identified. No clear record of what truly happened. Only fragments of reports. Only conflicting stories. Only silence. And in one of the coldest places on Earth, where sound travels far across frozen lakes, silence became the only witness. What do you think really happened at Angikuni Lake? Was it a tragic disappearance? A misunderstood relocation? Or a mystery created by time and storytelling? Leave your theory in the comments. And if you want more real, unsolved mysteries like this, subscribe for the next story, because some disappearances are never meant to be solved.